I came to the meditation practice pretty young, but I was already in my 20s, as Doug mentioned, in the Peace Corps in Thailand. But then in thinking from this perspective, how much better it would have been had I been introduced as a teenager in high school, it would have saved me a lot of distress. And it was interesting being invited to come and give this talk. It made me just reflect upon those very early years and going back to my high school years. And it's a good thing that as one ages, the long-term memory stays, even as the short-term memory goes, because it was kind of fun just thinking back to those years. And reflecting on the power of mindfulness, and what it could bring, to people of that age. I was thinking at that time, there were really two big questions that were powerfully compelling, even though they were unarticulated. It's not that I actually could articulate the question in my mind, but in looking back, I see these were really the driving questions of my life at that time and actually since. And the first really big question that confronts us as we come into greater awareness, greater consciousness, is who am I? This is the most fundamental question of our lives. And I remember at some point in those early years, at one point I remember looking into a mirror and desperately wanting to know who was behind what I was seeing. Who was behind the image of my face and my body? Who was on the inside? Because all I knew was kind of this kind of whirlwind of emotions and thoughts and uncertainties and confusion, but there was no sense of who was at the center of it, of who I was. So it's really, in a way, it's the first beginning of our looking at how we can be authentic in our lives. What is authenticity? How can I be authentic? We have to know ourselves in order to do that. So in high school, these were still unformed questions, and very unformed. I mean, in those years, this goes back a long way. It wasn't even a question that was raised, and so now when I look at what's happening, with these programs and in the schools, the fact that people in their teenage years are asking the question is amazing. So I didn't come to any kind of way of understanding it till I was in the Peace Corps, and I was sent to Thailand. I actually applied to go to East Africa, but destiny would have it. They sent me to Thailand, and I might have been teaching African drumming. But it turns out, I was teaching English at a school right in Bangkok, and I started going to discussion groups. And I had studied philosophy in college. So I went to these discussion groups for Westerners in Bangkok. It was led by a couple of Buddhist monks. And I would go to these groups, and I would ask so many questions in these groups that people stopped coming. Because I was, and we've all been in groups like that, with people like that. Well, so finally, I think it was out of some desperation, one of the monks said, "Joseph, why don't you try meditating?" I think it was just a way to get me to be a little quiet. Well, at that time, unlike now, I mean, nobody I knew, I didn't know anything about meditation, nobody I knew meditated. Here I was in the Far East, it was all very exotic, I was fairly young. So it gives me the very basic instructions, and I got my cushion together and all my paraphernalia, and I set my clock for 5 minutes because I didn't want to sit too much. But it was amazing. Something amazing happened in those first 5 minutes. And maybe it's what happens to teens on these retreats or in school, being introduced to mindfulness. What I saw, even from the very beginning, was that there was a way to look into the mind as well as looking out through it. So it was like turning in place. So instead of all my attention being outward, I could look to see what was inside and that there was a way to do it. There was a methodology. So this is how we can begin to find out about ourselves. Begins to answer the question, who am I? And what is authentic within myself. Some years later, after the Peace Corps, when I went to India to continue my practice, one of the first things my teacher, Munindraji, said to me, and it really just confirmed my commitment to the path because it was so simple and so much common sense. He said, if you want to understand the mind, sit down and observe it. So there's nothing to join, there was no ritual, there was no ceremony, nothing. It was like, if we want to understand ourselves, if we want to understand our minds, we have to just sit down and take a look. And that's what mindfulness is all about. It's like taking a look. Understanding that there is a way to do this, that there's actually a methodology to follow and that many people have done it before us and can actually guide us on this inward journey. This is a huge thing. Just turning in place and beginning to look inward is life transforming, because we get such a clear and honest look at what's going on inside. At our thoughts, our emotions, our fears, our confusions, at the love, at the compassion, everything. We really begin to see the whole picture. So again, my appreciation of what iBme is doing in terms of making this available for young people in high school, and sometimes even younger. It's just amazing to be starting out, on life's journey with this tool, of self-understanding. It's an incredible gift. So this is the first big question that was up for me and probably for all of you, in those years and in the years since, of who am I? This is a question that the practice of mindfulness can address. The second big question that was up for me then, and I think for all of us, and actually for all of us during our lifetimes, is how can I be happy? How can I be happy in my life? So I came across a little story or quote from John Lennon, which I wanted to read because it was really good. So he said, when I was 5 years old, my mother always told me that happiness was the key to life. When I went to school, they asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up. I wrote down, happy. They told me I didn't understand the assignment. And I told them they didn't understand life. So I think that really captures it. Because, and this is something the Dalai Lama says often, really everybody wants to be happy. We want to find a genuine happiness in our lives. And it's here that mindfulness can be such a powerful tool for helping us to understand what actually brings happiness. Because we get so many different messages, from the media and from the internet and from our parents and schools and our peers, lots of input about what's going to make us happy? But how do we test it for ourselves? How do we really find out for ourselves what's true and what's not? I came across an advertisement. It was a magazine, or it said, "Instant gratification just got easier. Shopvogue.com." Okay, so for young people, it might not be Vogue. That is the appeal. But there are probably lots of websites which are saying the same message. Do this instant gratification will make us happy. Oh, there was another, advertising it's a wonderful field for understanding the messages, that we grow up with. There was one other advertisement that said, actually this was in a store window in New York. I was just walking down the street, and in the window there was a sign that said, "Don't let desire pass you by." So the message is, instant gratification, fulfill our desires, do this, get that, and this will make us happy. So this is a big part of the cultural message. We get a lot of message just from our peers. And in high school, I remember there was a lot of peer, sometimes peer pressure, but just peer interaction, about what's going to make us happy. Maybe it's, looking the right way, or having the right clothes, or being cool in some way, or, some external thing, and that's going to make us happy. So the question is, how do we sort all this out? How can we really test all these messages for ourselves in our own experience, and to see what's true, what actually brings happiness? So mindfulness really is the key to this, because mindfulness allows us to be with our own experience as it's unfolding, and to see, okay, is this really fulfilling or not? So I'll just give a few examples. And really to check it out. We need to check these things out for ourselves. And in the Buddhist teaching, and one of the things that I so appreciate about it, he said, don't believe anything. Don't believe what I say. Don't believe what's in the books. Put these various propositions into practice and see for yourself what really opens the heart, what brings happiness. So, for example, we can just pay attention to how we feel when we're being kind, and how we feel when we're not. When in some way we're being cruel or thoughtless. And just to watch, what does it feel like? What does it feel like when we include people in our field of friendliness? And what does it feel like when there are certain people that we exclude? What does that do to our own hearts? And again, this is all a great experiment. It's not even just to hear these words and believe, or think we know, but actually to taste the experience. What does it feel like when we really are looking or directing our attention to the good qualities in other people? And what does it feel like when we really are pointing out people's faults or drawbacks? And this would be an interesting experiment for all of us to make in watching the kind of speech we use. How often in our speech Are we talking about others? And just to watch, what's the tenor of the talk? Is it appreciating what's good about people, or is it, talking to others about what we don't like, or people's drawbacks? And how does that make us feel as we do this? So I had one story, again, coming to give this talk, it brought back a bunch of memories. So this was from my very early years in India. It was in the late 60s. I was living, it's called the Burmese Vihar, it's like a rest house for Burmese pilgrims to Bodh Gaya, which is the place the Buddha was enlightened. But at that time, Burma was closed, so Westerners were staying there. And it was people in those very early years just beginning the practice of mindfulness. We were all very into the meditation. So there was a small group of us. And I remember one evening, this one young woman, we were kind of gathering in kind of an evening, just a little social get-together. And she said that she had written a song about each one of us. Each stanza was about one of us. And just the assumption in my mind that it would be a kind of like a humorous roast, because that's what my mind would have done. Of just, picking out the foibles or the quirks or the... But instead, what she did, and it was 45 years later, I still remember this. What she did was she wrote a stanza about what she saw as the good qualities in each person. And it was so startling to me that anybody would even do that or think that way. And it was beautiful. It was just the feeling that was created by just that appreciation, of the good in each other. It's a remarkable way to go through life. But it takes practice, How do we do it? We need to be mindful, of what is going on in our minds, and cultivating some things and letting go of others. So we can be mindful and watch, are we being kind or not kind? Are we inclusive of other people or exclusive, excluding? Do we see what's good in others? Do we kind of harp on their faults? How do we feel when we're being generous or when we're being self-centered? An experience I had, and this again goes back to my early years as high school and just after. I remember having a thought, there was a certain situation, and I just had the thought to give something, to be generous in a certain situation. And I remember, and it was kind of outside what maybe would be a normal thing for a young person to do. And I remember having the thought, is it okay to be generous? Is this okay? And now, in looking back, it's sort of interesting that we have to learn that it's okay. That when we have a generous impulse, this is a good thing to do. We don't need to get permission to be generous. Again, it's worth checking out in ourselves, how do we feel as we're doing this? Right? And how does it feel when we're not, when we're just kind of self-centered? So this is all the gift of mindfulness. This is what mindfulness allows us to see and to explore. For those of you who have been on retreat or even have been doing a mindfulness practice for some time, know that part of the practice is also opening up to all those sides of ourselves that are not so great, that are not kind and generous and loving and friendly, because we have the other side as well in us. None of us, I don't think, are saints. Any saints in the room? Maybe, it's possible. But we're all a mix. We're all a mix of qualities. And so part of mindfulness is learning to see the whole show without judgment and without self-blame, because it's very easy, in doing an inward-looking practice, to begin, seeing these parts of ourselves, the not so wholesome parts, and then to feel guilty or self-judgmental or feel bad about ourselves or feel unworthy. But mindfulness is not that. It's just to see clearly so that we can understand, oh yeah, these qualities are good, they should be cultivated. These qualities are there, these I don't have to feed. I can let them go. There's a line from a poem by W.H. Auden, which I really love. He says, "Love your crooked neighbor with all your crooked heart." So it's just acknowledging, we're all in the same boat. We're all the mix, but we can move from an understanding, from a mindful awareness of the mix that we are, and move in the direction of greater happiness. I'll just close this little, these reflections with something that Thich Nhat Hanh, the well-known Vietnamese Zen master and poet and mindfulness teacher, said, this is a bit of a paraphrase, he said, "Mindfulness is a clever way to enjoy life. Happiness is available. Please help yourselves to it." And so that's what the practice can offer. That's what these programs at iBme is offering. To be learning this in high school as a teenager is just amazing. So, thank you.
In your 40 years of teaching, have you found that mindfulness is something everyone can do?
Almost everyone. Mm-hmm. Almost everyone finds it difficult. So the practice, as you know, it's very simple, but it's not easy. And so it really takes a discipline of practice, just like when we want to learn anything. There are some people, and this is at one end, a really extreme end, but who might have some really difficult mental illness where there may not be the capacity for mindfulness. And then, for example, even people in that situation, it may be that practice is more like loving kindness, might be more stabilizing. But as I said, that's just a small number at one end of the spectrum. I think for almost everybody, it's possible. Do you think so? When I started practicing, I had zero concentration. I would sit and think for the whole hour, and I liked it. I studied philosophy, so I was good. Nobody's bothering me. I have all this time. It took a lot. It was not easy, and so it makes me confident that if I could do it, anybody can do it. Yeah.
Hi, Mr. Goldstein.
Hi.
My question is very simple.
Good.
So if mindfulness means something different to everybody, would that be a problem?
Okay, that's an interesting question. If mindfulness means something different to different people, is that a problem? I think the question would then be to find out with each person what it means for them. Because sometimes we may think we're being mindful, but it's not actually mindfulness. So I'll give you an example. Often people will ask, well, just say in a few words, what's mindfulness? And it's a bit like asking, what is art? What is love? Just in 2 words. But very often, the common response might be, well, being in the present. Living in the present moment and not being lost in the past, not being lost in the future. So that could be somebody's understanding of mindfulness, right? But I'm going to use one particular example, but you could extrapolate. Are you familiar with black labs? I like them because they're just so playful and friendly. They're in the present moment. I call it black lab consciousness. They're completely in the moment, responding to present moment experience. They just don't look mindful. And so it's more than just being in the moment. So this is just an example of, and one of the values of having a teacher is so when people come with whatever their understanding of mindfulness is, it can be explored. Okay, is this really what it is, or is it something else? You're welcome.
I have 2 questions. So, first one is, I know about mindfulness because I'm a sports fan, and I know a famous coach called Phil Jackson. He's really a great mindfulness guy, and like some great players like Kobe Bryant and Russell Wilson, they are also involved in mindfulness. So in what ways do you think mindfulness can improve sports performance?
That's a great question. So how can then mindfulness improve sports performance? And Doug probably has a lot to say about this since he's a sportsman. One simple example, but there are probably many, many ramifications of this. Really learning to be embodied as we're engaged in the activity rather than lost in some mind's thoughts which are really taking us out of the moment. Cooperation. Are we in it from an ego perspective? And especially in team sports. Is there an ability to see the team as a collective and not be just playing from that ego point of view? Not only in sports, but in so many activities. Really learning how to relax, into the moment rather than being filled with anxiety or tension. So it's just all of these ways. Yeah.
And another question is like a daily life question. So we are doing a mindfulness part of befriending to other people. And one of my friends, she's in another boarding school, and she calls me every week, and she sometimes complains about some stuff at her school and some bad things. But I don't really want to complain with her about something in our school, but that's kind of weird because she's complaining to me, and if I really want to use something I learned from mindfulness to be calm and just be friendly to others, that's kind of weird. So what do you think I should do?
No. Right. It's almost like there's some expectation that you should complain back, and not wanting to do that.
Yeah.
So I think a way to get underneath the complaint might be to really start asking or inquiring what your friend's feelings are behind the complaining mind. Because it must be making the situation that she's complaining about must be making her feel a certain way. either sad or angry or afraid or something. And so you could connect with her on a deeper level. Oh, that must make you feel this way. What is that like? How are you with that? So you're entering then, you're deepening the whole conversation using mindfulness, as a vehicle for exploring, and it might be really helpful for her as well, or him. Yeah.
Where do you think mindfulness is going in America and across the world?
Well, if you had asked me that 15 years ago, I could never have imagined where it would be today. It's totally amazing. That actually, I don't know if I heard it correctly, but that a mindful class is a requirement at the school? That's something. You are required to be mindful. But
it's an invitation to practice, but they have
so it really is hard to predict. I mean, it is fantastic, that it's spread as much as it has. So I think the danger or the caution, and I see this beginning to happen, is that sometimes, people will take a one-day course in mindfulness and then start teaching. So then the quality of what's being taught, who knows where that's going to go. Because as you all know, it's not always easy, when we start looking into ourselves. And it's a sensitive matter. When we really begin to explore the depth of our feelings and emotions and our bodies, and it's not a light thing. It's not a light undertaking. And so to have, a relatively good understanding of what it's about and the terrain is important. So even as it's great that it's spreading so much, just would like to support, the training of teachers who are doing it. But maybe it'll change the whole world. Who knows?
Hello. So my question's a bit multifaceted, and I'm just going to throw out a whole bunch of stuff, and don't feel the need to answer all of it. But, okay, so I kind of want to explore the whole idea of Westernized Buddhism and how it crossed over with mindfulness. So off the bat, or rather, could you define a distinction between Westernized Buddhism, or what has become known as Westernized Buddhism, and mindfulness, and if there is one, maybe also could you tell us a little bit about what this Westernized Buddhism is now versus what it was when you first brought it to the United States, because it seems to be now like a creature of its own. It's growing on its own, and it is out of your hands.
It is.
Yes. So, it's now it's a national subject. So yeah.
Okay, first, I think it's a mistake to equate mindfulness with Buddhism. Because mindfulness is a quality in the mind that has a very specific power and function, and it's key to the Buddhist teachings in terms of awakening and understanding ourselves. But the teachings of the Buddha are also vast, so they encompass much more than just mindfulness. So it's not, so they shouldn't just be equated as if mindfulness and Buddhism, either in the East or West, is the same thing. Mindfulness is one aspect, and a key aspect. One of the big differences that I've seen over all these years of teaching in terms of the Westernization, both of the teaching, of the fuller teachings of Buddhism and of mindfulness specifically, is that there's been an integration of the more Western paradigm of understanding the mind, which really is psychology, and that's, in our culture, that's been the way people have looked into their minds. And a lot has been learned, in all of those disciplines on the psychological level. That level is not addressed so specifically in the way mindfulness is taught in Asia, or how we first taught it when we came here. We weren't so much addressing the psychological level of things, but just over the years of teaching, we really began to see the importance of integrating aspects of that understanding into the practice of mindfulness. So that's been a big change, and it's, just as one example, it's quite striking, really. I'm now right in the middle of teaching our annual 3-month retreat at the center in Barrie. And it's amazing how, and not only on this retreat, but on all retreats, how many people come with some kind of trauma in the background. It's startling. This is not a small number of people. This is a lot of people of all kinds. And so we've really had to learn, okay, how can mindfulness work with these issues? When these are up and strong, there's a different sensibility that's needed. So this is just one part of what I mean by incorporating more psychological level into the level of more traditional insight into impermanence, and so that's been a big shift. Also, this is just a comment. One of the things I learned from my teacher, Menindraji, people would ask him all kinds of questions, and then he'd just answer whatever he wanted to answer. It didn't matter whether it was related to the question or not. So I feel I'm about to go off on something like that, because I'm not sure this is really about what you asked. But one of the things that's really different as mindfulness teachings have come to the West, and meditation in general, is just it's more gender equality. In the West, it's pretty patriarchal. Just in the traditional Asian and the monastic form in Asia, and there's quite a difference, for example, between monks and nuns. Just in the West, it's really, that's just not the case. There've been men and women teachers, and now bringing all people, and there's a growing awareness of the whole spectrum of gender identity, and so there's just a whole growing awareness that you don't find in Asia, about this. So that's a big part of the change.
I have a bit of a two-part question. I was wondering what inspired you, or what was your inspiration to start this work, and what steps you may have had to take to begin?
And when you say begin the work, do you mean the practice of mindfulness or the teaching?
I guess a little of both.
Mm-hmm. I think what prompted me were those two questions that I talked about. Is that I had that compelling, need to discover who I was. Who is it that's on the inside of what I'm seeing? Yeah, and so that was just a very powerful, so it was just that desire to understand. And then when I found a way, it was like in that first 5 minutes of just looking in, it was just revelatory to me. I was so excited. I started inviting my friends over to watch me meditate. I did. They didn't come back too often. But actually, I'm still doing it. So thank you all for coming. Yeah, it was just so exciting to me. That there's this way to... And then the teaching happened very organically. I was in India for over like a 7-year period or so. This was after the Peace Corps. And after being there, I don't know, around 4 years or so, doing a lot of practice, my teacher would just suggest to people who had just come and wanted to learn and had questions, oh, why don't you just ask Joseph? And so he'd just be referring people with questions. And then, a little time later, he said, why don't you give a talk? And then maybe a year or two later, why don't you lead a short retreat? So it was just very organic, and there was so much joy in doing it. I mean, I remember the feeling after my very first Dharma talk. I was high for days. The energy, because in kind of speaking about all this, it's so amazing how, no matter how we may be feeling beforehand, or it's like, just in speaking about this, Joseph gets out of the way. And then it's just something coming through. And there's a purity in that is just so inspiring. And then when I came back to this country in '74, and that was the first summer of Naropa Institute in Colorado. It was kind of the first Buddhist gathering. And so we just caught the wave. There was just, the timing was perfect. There was just a wave of incredible interest, and it just all unfolded. And this manifestation of the work iBme is doing and just getting it out into the square, it's fantastic. I mean, I'm so admiring of all of you. It's just a fantastic thing to be doing. And then you're going to spread it out, and it's the best.
So, we are doing mindfulness practice, and, I'm becoming, paying more attention to details. But, sometimes I became, when I was standing in front of the sea, I became so happy. But when I was staring at the leaves on the ground, I feel, really sad. So I'm become, more sensitive. Do you think it's a good thing, or it's not good?
I think it's a great thing if you can stay mindful of what you're feeling. So you're not necessarily getting lost or drowning in all the feelings that may be coming up, but getting more sensitive to just the world around us and to other people and to the whole range of your own inner life. That sensitivity is beautiful. I mean, that's a real poetic sensitivity, but can we do that without being overwhelmed by what we're feeling? And that's what mindfulness can really offer you. So you feel the sadness, you feel the joy. There's a Taoist phrase which I really like, just describing life, the 10,000 joys and the 10,000 sorrows. So this is what life is. And so mindfulness just gives us some balance as we experience all that.
Hi, I've heard you speak a couple of times before, but I particularly enjoyed you speaking to young people, and the fact that it took you back to age 16 and age 22 or 23. So my question is really one of curiosity, but maybe there's a teaching point in it. Because I was curious who you were then, or if I had met you then, what I would have experienced of you. So my question is really, to the extent to which you can remember it, what's your sense of either who you were or how people experienced you then, and the same question now, really as a way of maybe capturing a bit the journey that you've had and maybe what these young people have to look forward to.
I think the big changes really have been internal in terms of how I understand what's going on inside, because even in that age, I was basically a friendly guy, and had really easy, friendly relations with people. And early on, and it's what I talked a little bit about, and that's why I brought it up, I just had that feeling of wanting to be inclusive rather than, and I remember in high school, that's how I was, and I had a lot of friends. But as I think with all of us, as I began to look inside, I saw a lot of qualities that weren't so great. A lot of self-judgment and yes, just seeing the more unwholesome part. And the practice has really helped me to see all that without the self-blame, without the self-judgment. It's sort of what I was talking about. So the mind becomes just much more spacious and relaxed in seeing the whole show. And that's been a big shift. I remember in my early years of practice in India, after beginning the practice, I'd go running to my teacher, Manindraji, basically saying, "Oh, I'm such a terrible person," because I was just seeing the stuff that's in most of us. And he would just laugh and say, just go back and be mindful. But over the years, it just got a lot easier to see that and not be caught up in it, and to let go of the self-judgment about it all. And so that makes everything a lot easier. That's what comes to mind in the moment.